Good morning, Admiral. The words didn't just break the silence. They shattered it, landing in the middle of my wedding reception like a heavy stone dropped into a glass-still pond. The ripples moved outward instantly. Lively conversation died in throats. Silver forks hovered midair, dripping with cake or salmon. Chairs screeched against the polished hardwood as 100 guests turned in a synchronized wave of confusion. I can still recall the sound of shifting fabric, the collective rustle of dozens of people twisting in their seats, their eyes darting, trying to identify the target of that unexpected title. Standing near the entrance was a man I hadn't seen in years, clad in a perfectly tailored navy suit. He stood with a rigid, practiced grace, his shoulders squared, his gaze locked onto mine with a ferocity that ignored everyone else in the room. And then he saluted. It was a crisp, razor-sharp movement, the kind born of 30 years of muscle memory. For a heartbeat, time suspended. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Across the room, I saw Harold, my father-in-law of less than an hour, go completely bloodless. The confident, smug smile he'd worn all morning didn't just fade, it collapsed. His jaw loosened, his mouth hanging slightly open, as if the invisible wires of his ego had been suddenly snipped. But that moment, that startling collision of my past and my present, didn't begin at the yacht club. It had been brewing for years, a storm gathering on a horizon I thought I had left behind. It began with a choice. After 3 decades of living by the clock, the chain of command, and the crushing weight of responsibility, I chose to disappear into a quiet life. I have never been the kind of woman who craved the spotlight or needed her rank to announce her entrance. When I finally retired, I traded the steel-gray hulls of the fleet for a small coastal town in Virginia, just a few miles outside of Norfolk. It was a town governed by the tides, not by directives. Mornings began with the haunting cry of gulls and ended with the rhythmic creak of neighbors' porch swings. It was steady, familiar, and honest. I loved the anonymity of it. My house was a modest affair, white siding, a narrow porch where I drank my tea, and a garden that became my new command. I grew tomatoes that tasted like summer sun, trimmed my hedges with surgical precision, and kept a small American flag by the door. I didn't fly it out of habit, but out of a quiet, private respect for the ghosts I carried. To the local grocer and the postman, I was simply Evelyn. Not ma'am, not commander, and certainly not admiral. Just Evelyn. And that was the only title I wanted. I met Richard at a community fundraiser, the kind of local event where the air smells of charcoal and someone inevitably burns the casserole. I had brought my signature lemon bars. He had arrived late with a box of store-bought cookies, apologizing with a self-deprecating grin before anyone could even take a bite. There was a kindness in him that felt like a rare commodity, not the performative kindness of a man looking for praise, but a quiet, steady presence. We spent nearly an hour that night leaning against a folding table, talking about old books, the magnetic pull of the ocean, and the peculiar vulnerability of starting over in the autumn of one's life. He told me he'd been a widower for 5 years. I told him I understood the weight of loss. Neither of us probed too deeply. Richard never interrogated me about my past. He knew I had worked in government, and that vague explanation seemed to satisfy him. Perhaps it was a generational trait, or perhaps he simply understood that some chapters of a life don't need to be read aloud to be respected. He trusted me, and in return, I found a sanctuary in his company. I didn't want to be loved for what I had been, I wanted to be loved for who I was. His family, however, was a different story entirely. The Richardsons were established people, the kind who treated their family name like a corporate brand. Harold, the patriarch, had spent 40 years in federal contracting, navigating the corridors of power with a shark's instinct. He carried himself with the heavy, unearned gravity of a man who believed every ounce of his success was a testament to his inherent superiority. He didn't just want respect, he demanded acknowledgement. The first time we met, he shook my hand with a grip that felt like a test. He looked me up and down, his eyes scanning me like a customs officer looking for contraband. So, Richard tells me you had a quiet career in the civil service? I offered him a polite, practiced smile. I suppose you could say that, Harold. He nodded, but his eyes remained sharp with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. Over the following months, as my relationship with Richard deepened, Harold's tones settled into a patronizing rhythm. He wasn't overtly rude, men like him rarely are, but he dealt in microslights. Small, calculated comments designed to remind me of my place. I imagine retirement is much easier when one's expectations weren't particularly high to begin with, he'd say over dinner, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. Or, "You've done quite well for yourself, Evelyn, considering Richard has always been a man of generous impulses." I learned to let the barbs slide off me. At my age, you realize that most battles aren't worth the ammunition. Richard didn't see the edge in his father's words, or if he did, he chose to believe it was just Dad being Dad. He loved Harold, and I loved Richard, so I chose peace. When Richard proposed, it was as unadorned as our first meeting. We were sitting on my porch, watching the sun sink into the Chesapeake Bay. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and spoke with a raw honesty that brought tears to my eyes. "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left without you by my side, Evelyn." There were no grand gestures, no audience. Just us. I said yes. But as the wedding planning began, the tension became a physical presence in the room. Harold's questions became more surgical. "What exactly was your role in operations? Was it administrative? Secretarial? Does your pension provide sufficient coverage, or will Richard be assuming your liabilities?" I answered him with the same calm I used to maintain during congressional briefings. "I worked in operations, Harold. It was a long career, and I am quite comfortable." It wasn't enough for him. He wanted a number. He wanted a rank. He wanted something he could weigh on his internal scale of human worth. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling planning lunch, he leaned back and sighed. "You know, Evelyn, a marriage at our level isn't just about companionship. It's about standing. It's about reputation." I met his gaze, my expression a mask of professional neutrality. I couldn't agree more. He nodded, briefly satisfied, before adding the final twist of the knife. "I just want to be certain my son isn't settling for less than he deserves." The table went dead silent. Richard shifted, his face reddening. "Dad, that's enough." I placed my hand gently on Richard's arm, stopping him. "It's all right," I said softly. And it was not because the insult didn't sting, but because I had spent a lifetime observing men like Harold. They always reveal more about their own insecurities than they do about their targets. I could feel it building, though, the unspoken judgment, the quiet dismissal. I knew it would eventually break the surface, likely when it could cause the most public damage. I could have ended it then. I could have laid out my service record, my medals, the history of the men and women who had served under my command. I could have crushed his ego with a single sentence. But that wouldn't have changed who he was, and it wouldn't have shown me the true character of the family I was joining. So I stayed silent. I waited. Because respect that is only given to a title isn't respect at all. By the week of the wedding, I had accepted a hard truth. Not every family greets change with warmth, even when they label it as happiness. We were to be married on a Saturday in late May at a small Episcopal church near the waterfront. It was meant to be elegant but understated, fresh flowers, a reception at the local yacht club, and a guest list of people who actually cared about us. At 60, a wedding isn't about the spectacle, it's about a promise made with clear eyes. But Harold was a man who lived for the spectacle. To him, the wedding was a theater where he was the lead actor. 3 days before the ceremony, we went to his home for a family dinner. His wife, Diane, had prepared a pot roast, and the dining room was a museum of proper living, polished silver, pressed runners, and a quiet, suffocating atmosphere. Diane was a gentle woman, but one who had been hollowed out by decades of accommodating Harold's massive personality. Richard's sister, Marianne, was there with her husband, Kent. Marianne was constantly scanning the room, checking for social cues, while Kent was the type of man who only spoke when he had something sharp to say. Dinner was a minefield. For 20 minutes, we discussed flowers and seating charts. Then, Harold set his glass down with a deliberate thud. "So, Evelyn, I've been meaning to ask again. What was your actual title? Your final one?" The room went quiet. I cut a piece of roast beef, my movements slow and deliberate. I worked in naval operations, Harold. That's a department, not a title, he countered with a smirk. No, I replied calmly. It isn't. He let out a short, mocking laugh. Well, I suppose some jobs are simply harder to explain to civilian minds than others. Richard looked up, his patience fraying. Dad, why does this matter? Harold raised his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. I'm just making conversation, son. A man ought to know the details of the woman joining his lineage. I sipped my tea and let the silence hang. Silence is its own form of command. It forces the other person to fill the vacuum, usually with their own folly. I'm just surprised, that's all, Harold continued, ignoring Richard's glare. Marriage is serious, especially at our age. Finances, background, stability. These aren't things you just gloss over. We haven't glossed over anything, Richard snapped. Harold gave a thin, icy smile. You say that now. I could feel the heat of the room rising, but inside, I remained at absolute zero. Calm is not the absence of emotion. It is the refusal to let emotion steer the ship. I have done quite well taking care of myself for a long time, Harold, I said. I'm sure you believe that, he replied. The words were laced with a toxic condescension. Marian stared at her plate. Diane looked like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. In that moment, I realized that Harold didn't just dislike me, he resented my self-containment. He understood pedigrees and salaries. He understood things he could categorize. But a woman who didn't volunteer her history for his inspection unsettled him. After dinner, I stepped out onto their back patio to breathe. Richard followed me out a moment later. I'm so sorry, Evelyn. He's been worse than usual. I leaned against the railing, looking out at the darkening trees. You don't have to apologize for his manners, Richard. I do. He's obsessed with the idea that I'm being taken. He thinks he's the only one who can see the real world. He paused, looking at me with a desperate kind of gentleness. You could tell me, whatever it is you're keeping back. I've never pushed because I didn't want to pry, but sometimes I feel like there's a whole part of you standing right behind you, and I'm the only one who can't see it. That hurt more than any of Harold's insults. I turned to him and took his hands. Richard, there are parts of my life I don't talk about because I spent decades in places where talking too much was dangerous. Privacy isn't a secret, it's a comfort I earned. I know, he said, his voice cracking slightly. But I'm not your commanding officer. I'm the man who loves you. And I love you for your heart, not your questions, I whispered. That's not an answer, Evelyn. No, I admitted. It isn't. We stood there in the fading light, the distance between us momentarily bridged by honesty, but still shadowed by what remained unsaid. The next day was a blur of logistics, punctuated by Harold's constant, grating presence. He questioned the guest list, asterisk, are you sure your side isn't a little sparse? Asterisk, and the music. He never raised his voice, but his contempt was a polished, refined thing. By Friday night, I was alone in my guest room, laying out my clothes. On the dresser sat a small, weathered jewelry box. Inside, wrapped in silk, was an object I hadn't touched in years. I opened the lid, looked at the tarnished silver and gold, and felt the weight of it in my soul. Not yet, I thought. I closed the box. The house was full of that artificial, strained quiet that families create when they are desperate to force harmony. I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I had spent my life in rooms where a single wrong word could start a war. Compared to that, a difficult father-in-law should have been nothing. And yet, I felt a premonition deep in my bones. Harold wasn't finished. He had been probing for a weakness all week, trying to find a way to place me beneath him in his invisible hierarchy. Tomorrow, with a room full of witnesses, he would finally say exactly what he thought of me. And I suspected he would live to regret it. I woke before dawn on my wedding day. It's an old habit. The body remembers the time for briefings and pre-flight inspections long after the uniform is put away. I lay there listening to the house creak, watching the gray-blue light of a Virginia morning filter through the curtains. By 8 a.m., the house was a hive of nervous energy. Diane was pushing coffee on everyone. Marian was fussing with garment bags. Richard had already left for the church, for which I was grateful. I needed the silence to center myself. My dress was ivory silk, simple, elegant, and dignified. As Marian zipped me up, she caught my eye in the mirror. "You look beautiful, Evelyn." "Truly." "Thank you, Marianne." She hesitated, her hand lingering on my shoulder. "I'm sorry about my father. He gets fixed on things. Once he decides he understands someone, he doesn't leave any room to be wrong." I looked at her reflection and saw the fatigue of a daughter who had spent a lifetime navigating her father's ego. "You don't have to carry his weight," I told her. "Maybe not," she sighed. "But somehow we all do." The ceremony was a sanctuary. The church was flooded with warm, golden light. When I stepped into the aisle and saw Richard, his face crumbled into a look of such pure, raw gratitude that the rest of the world ceased to exist. The minister's words were simple. Richard's voice shook as he said his vows. Mine was steady, though the emotion behind it was a rising tide. I had commanded battle groups and stood before world leaders, yet nothing had ever felt as monumental as promising to walk beside this one man for the rest of our days. When we were pronounced husband and wife, the applause felt like a shield. For a few hours, the shadow of Harold's judgment vanished. We moved to the yacht club for the reception, a place of polished wood, brass fixtures, and the smell of salt air. By mid-afternoon, the room was humming with the easy joy of a successful party. But Harold was drinking. Not enough to stumble, but enough to sharpen his edges. When it came time for the toasts, Richard stood first, giving a beautiful, brief speech about how love in the second half of life is deeper because it carries the wisdom of loss. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. I squeezed his hand as he sat down. Then Harold rose. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon, the sound ringing out like a bell. He waited for the room to go perfectly silent, basking in the attention. He looked relaxed, practiced, a man who had spent weeks preparing for this moment of public clarification. "Well," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This is certainly a memorable day." He paused, a predatory glint in his eye, and looked directly at me. "A day for revelations." "I've watched my son walk through some incredibly difficult years," Harold continued, his voice projecting with a practiced, theatrical resonance that commanded every ear in the ballroom. "Losing a wife. It changes a man to his very core. It leaves him vulnerable in ways he may not even recognize, opening doors to influences he isn't prepared to handle." Beside me, I felt Richard shift, his muscles tightening into a hard knot of defensive energy. Harold didn't blink. He paced a few inches to the left, the quintessential patriarch. "So, when a new person enters the frame later in life, naturally, a father has questions. It is a burden of care." The smile on his face remained perfectly fixed, a mask of paternal concern, but his eyes had sharpened into two cold, blue flints. I could see the guests exchanging uneasy glances, the festive atmosphere curdling into something voyeuristic and cruel. "And I'll be the first to admit," he said, his tone dropping into a conspiratorial register, "I had my concerns. Deep ones." Richard's fork hit the china with a sharp, metallic ring. "Dad, that's enough." Harold waved a hand lightly, the gesture dismissive and airy, though his gaze never left mine. "No, no, Richard. Hear me out. I am speaking with the honesty that this family deserves. Transparency is the bedrock of a home, is it not?" A low murmur rippled through the room like a sudden draft. Diane kept her head down, her eyes fixed intently on the embroidery of the tablecloth, as if she could disappear into the threads. Harold turned just enough to include me in his orbit without actually granting me the respect of a direct confrontation. "You see, Evelyn has always been something of a mystery to us. A closed book with a very elegant cover." I sat perfectly still, my spine a straight line of iron. "She is private," he said, drawing out the word until it felt like an accusation. "Exceedingly private. Which, in a stranger, is a virtue. But when a woman enters a legacy family and keeps so much hidden, people naturally begin to wonder what, exactly, is being buried beneath that silence." The room fell into a vacuum of sound. Somewhere near the back, a guest set a glass down too hard, the clink echoing like a gunshot. Richard began to stand, his face flushed with a mixture of protective fury and sheer disbelief. I said that's enough, Harold. But Harold was intoxicated by his own momentum now. His voice grew stronger, losing the polished veneer of the host and taking on the jagged edge of a prosecutor. My son is a decent man. A trusting man. Perhaps, to his detriment, he is far too trusting. And I will say what others here are too polite to whisper. When someone appears out of nowhere with vague stories of government work and a quiet life, a man is entitled to ask whether she is seeking a partner for love or a benefactor for security. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I heard Marion suck in a jagged breath. Diane looked as if she were on the verge of a breakdown. The guests didn't look at Harold anymore. They turned toward me with that helpless, morbid attention people give to a victim of a public execution. Richard pushed back his chair, the legs screeching against the floor. You need to stop right now. This is over. Harold, flushed with the terrible, misplaced courage of a man who mistakes a captive audience for an approving one, pressed on. I am merely protecting my son. If that causes embarrassment, then so be it. It is a price I am willing to pay. Then he looked directly at me, his lip curling in a faint sneer of triumph. For all we know, Evelyn, you spent your entire career pushing papers in some windowless basement, learning just enough jargon to make yourself sound important to a man who wanted to believe you. But this family does not owe respect based on vague hints and polished manners. Respect is earned through truth. The silence that followed was heavy, oily, and thick with the collective realization that a boundary had been crossed that could never be repaired. Richard turned to me, his eyes wide with horror and apology. Evelyn, I placed my hand gently, firmly, over his wrist. It's all right, I said. And strangely, it was. Humiliation is a weapon that only functions if you accept the standards of the person wielding it. Harold thought he was stripping me bare, but he was only tearing down the imaginary straw woman he had built to scare himself. He had no access to the reality of me. I rose from my seat slowly. I didn't use the table for support. I didn't rush. Every eye in the room tracked my movement, as if I were a predator suddenly standing in their midst. Harold's face was still red, but I caught the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Bullies thrive on collapse. They are utterly unnerved by composure. They know how to handle tears. They are energized by shouting. But calm? Calm is a language they cannot translate. You are entitled to your opinions, Harold, I said, my voice even and carrying the resonance of a direct order. But you are not entitled to invent a life for me simply because I declined to perform my history for your approval. A few guests lowered their heads. Others gave nearly imperceptible nods. Harold let out a brittle, desperate laugh. Then perhaps you'd like to enlighten us? Tell us the grand truth? There it was. The invitation. Smug, poisoned, and public. I could have ended it right then. I could have demolished him with a single sentence. Instead, I looked him in the eye and said, no. I don't think I need to. That unsettled him more than any outburst would have. He opened his mouth, likely to deliver an even crueler barb, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the reception hall swung open. At first, it seemed like a late arrival, a minor distraction. But then, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted in a way I recognized from 1,000 briefings. Heads didn't turn out of curiosity. They turned because the sheer force of authority had entered the space. A tall man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit stepped inside. He was silver-haired and straight-backed, carrying himself with the unmistakable, rhythmic gait of a man who had spent 40 years in uniform. 2 younger men followed him, staying exactly 2 paces behind, a respectful, practiced distance. Harold's expression withered. He knew him. Everyone in his circle knew him. As the man moved through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea, his gaze didn't flicker toward Harold or Richard. It stayed locked on me. In that moment, I realized the day Harold had tried so hard to dominate had finally spun beyond his control. The room held its breath. I recognized him instantly, though it had been years since we had shared the same air. Time had etched deeper lines into his face, and his hair was now the color of a winter sky, but his posture was a monument. Men like him don't forget who they are, even when the medals are in a drawer. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitaker. Harold's superior in the civilian sector, and once, a lifetime ago, my colleague in a different theater of operations. He walked past tables of guests who instinctively straightened their posture as he passed. There is a specific kind of presence that requires no introduction. It is felt in the marrow. When he reached me, he stopped. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, in one smooth, unmistakable motion, he brought his hand to his brow in a formal, crisp salute. "Good morning, Admiral." You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. The words didn't echo, but they cut through every whispered assumption and every petty insult Harold had hurled. For a heartbeat, I didn't move. Not because I was unsure, but because I was absorbing the finality of the mask falling away. Then, quietly, I returned the salute. "Good morning, Tom," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. A ripple of shock vibrated through the room. Sharp intakes of breath, the frantic shifting of chairs, the clatter of silverware. I turned my head slightly to look at Harold. He had gone a shade of gray I usually associated with stone. The confidence, the perceived authority he had worn like a bespoke blazer all afternoon, it was gone. In its place was something raw, pure, unadulterated fear. His mouth opened, then snapped shut. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been throwing stones at a fortress. Whitaker lowered his hand and gave me a small, respectful nod. He glanced around the room, finally acknowledging the audience. "I apologize for the unannounced intrusion," he said, his voice projecting easily to the back of the hall. I was informed of the occasion late, but I felt it would be highly inappropriate not to pay my respects to a colleague of such standing. His eyes flickered toward Harold. There was no anger there, only a devastating, clinical clarity. Harold swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. "Admiral." I didn't realize." Whitaker didn't change his expression. "No," he said calmly. "You clearly didn't." That was it. No shouting, no public reprimand. But it landed with more weight than anything Harold had said all day. Every eye was on me now, no longer skeptical, no longer pitying. It was a look of profound, uneasy recognition. Richard stood beside me, as still as a statue. "Evelyn," he whispered. I turned to him. There was no accusation in his eyes, only a dizzying sense of awe. I reached for his hand, my fingers lacing through his. "I was going to tell you," I said softly. "I know," he replied. And I believed him. Whitaker stepped to the side, acting as a silent anchor. One of the guests, an older man from the local yacht club, whispered to his wife, "Did he say Admiral?" Not quite a paper pusher then, was she? The atmosphere had transformed. People were sitting straighter. The triviality of the wedding gossip had been incinerated. Even Harold took a tentative step forward, looking as if he were unsure if he even had the right to stand on the same rug as me. "Evelyn," he said, his voice trembling. I had no idea of the scope. Of the rank. I met his eyes. "I know you didn't. And that is the problem, Harold. You didn't know, so you assumed the least of me." Diane rose slowly, her hand pressed to her heart. "My goodness," she whispered. All this time. Marian looked back and forth between me and Whitaker, her face a map of unfolding realization. Kent, for once, was silenced. Harold tried again, his pride struggling to find a foothold. "If I had known." I stopped him with a look. "If you had known, you would have treated me with a borrowed respect. You would have been polite because of a title, not because of common decency. And that, Harold, is exactly why I didn't tell you." The room absorbed that truth. It wasn't just a rebuke of Harold, it was a mirror for everyone there. Whitaker folded his hands behind his back. "Admiral Carter," he said, addressing the room, served with distinction for over 30 years. She commanded operations that most of you will never read about in the papers and made decisions that saved more lives than this room could hold. I felt a slight flicker of my old discomfort. I had never been one for the spotlight. "Tom, please." He inclined his head. "Just stating the facts, Evelyn. Facts that should have been recognized long before I walked through those doors." Harold winced as if struck. I took a slow, deep breath. The tension was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a weight, it was a bridge. I looked at the guests, at Diane's shame, at Marianne's contemplation, and finally back at Richard, who was looking at me as if seeing me for the first time and loving me more for it. I didn't keep my past a secret to deceive anyone, I said, my voice steady. I kept it private because I wanted to live the rest of my life as a human being, not as a rank. I've spent decades in rooms where titles were everything, where authority had to be absolute. I gestured to the floral arrangements, the silk ribbons, the faces of our friends. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be about family. Harold's gaze dropped to the floor. I was wrong, he said. The words weren't polished. They were the first honest things he'd said all day. For a long moment, the silence was peaceful. Then Diane moved. She stepped toward me, her eyes brimming with regret. Evelyn, I am so incredibly sorry. I should have stood up. I should have said something. I touched her hand. You're saying it now. That's what matters. Richard finally exhaled, a faint, disbelieving smile breaking through. Well, he said, I suppose I should have asked a few more questions about those business trips to D.C. A ripple of genuine laughter broke the tension. It wasn't sharp or mocking. It was the sound of a room exhaling. Whitaker stepped back. I'll leave you to your celebration, he said. Thank you for coming, Tom. He gave me one last, respectful look. Always, Admiral. As the doors closed behind him, the weight of the room shifted again. The humiliation had been replaced by a profound reckoning. Harold remained where he was, still processing the wreckage of his own ego. Then, slowly, he took another step toward me. This time, he didn't look at me as a mystery to solve or a threat to neutralize. He looked at me as a person he desperately needed to understand. The music eventually resumed, though the trio in the corner played with a newfound, careful elegance. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. The sunset began to bleed orange and purple across the marina, casting long shadows over the terrace. Richard and I found ourselves on the dance floor. We moved slowly to an old jazz standard. You were a Navy admiral, he said, shaking his head. My wife is a literal admiral. Does it change things? I asked. He pulled me closer. It explains why you're so good at giving me that look when I forget to take the trash out. I laughed, resting my head against his shoulder. But seriously, he whispered. Why didn't you tell me? Not because of Harold. But because of us? Because I wanted you to see me, I said. I spent my whole life being the Admiral. I wanted to be Evelyn. I needed to know that someone could love the woman without the uniform. Richard was quiet for a long time, the music swirling around us. I do see you, he said. But I wish I'd known what you were carrying. All that responsibility. It's a lot to hold alone. I'm not alone anymore, I reminded him. As the evening wound down, I stepped out onto the back terrace to breathe in the salt air. The water was a dark obsidian sheet, reflecting the harbor lights. I thought I might find you out here. I turned. Harold stood in the doorway. He looked older, the bravado stripped away, leaving only the man underneath. He didn't try to dominate the space. I won't keep you, he said. I've spent my life thinking I could read people, that I knew who was important and who wasn't. I stayed silent, watching the boats rock in their slips. Today was a lesson I didn't know I needed, he continued, a small, humbled smile touching his lips. I judged you by your silence, Evelyn. I didn't realize your silence was actually strength. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see an adversary. I saw a man who had finally realized that the world was much larger than his own narrow view of it. It's a common mistake, Harold, I said gently. Just make sure it's the last time you make it. Today, the weight of the day settled into a single, sharp realization. There is a profound difference between merely reading people and truly understanding the architecture of their souls. For the first time, Harold exceeded my expectations. He turned toward me, and the mask he had worn all his life, a composite of wealth, status, and unearned superiority, finally fell away. His expression was plain, unvarnished, and entirely unguarded. I was cruel to you, he said, the words heavy with a new, bitter honesty. Yes, I replied, offering him no easy exit. I embarrassed my son. Yes, and I embarrassed myself. I let that admission hang in the salt-tinged air for a long beat. Also, yes. For the first time all day, a fragile thread of something resembling humility passed between us. It wasn't an apology that fixed the past, but it was a clearing of the atmosphere, the way a storm breaks the humidity. He slipped one hand into his pocket, looking out toward the horizon, and exhaled a long, slow breath. I've been trying to understand why I reacted to you the way I did, he admitted. Have you? I think so. He looked down at his shoes briefly, then met my eyes with a startling level of candor. You made me feel irrelevant. That surprised me. Not because it was an impossible truth, but because a man like Harold rarely possesses the vocabulary to admit he feels small. I remained silent, allowing him the space to fill the void. He continued, his voice softer now. Richard listens to you in a way he stopped listening to me years ago. It isn't out of disrespect, it's just that he trusts your judgment implicitly. And the less you felt the need to explain yourself to me, the more I felt shut out. I told myself I was protecting him from someone unknown. But the truth is, I didn't like not being the one with the final authority. There it was. It wasn't class anxiety, or suspicion of my background, or even simple disapproval. At the core of his vitriol was fear. It was the ordinary, terrifying fear of a man aging out of the role he had built his entire identity around. I had seen versions of that fear before in high-ranking officers facing their final days before retirement, in career politicians the morning after a lost election. I had seen it in men who mistake control for usefulness and then realize they have no idea who they are without a gavel or a rank. It is a difficult thing, Harold, I said quietly, to realize that the people you love no longer need your permission to build their lives. He nodded, a sharp, jerky movement that betrayed how much the statement hit home. The raw honesty in that gesture softened my resolve more than any rehearsed apology ever could have. Harold looked back toward the dark water. My father was the same sort of man, he said. Perhaps harder. In his house, respect was synonymous with obedience. You didn't question him. You didn't withhold information. And you certainly never let him feel small. And now? I asked. He gave a tired, self-deprecating smile. Now, I suppose I've been handing that legacy right down the line without ever stopping to think about it. I leaned back lightly against the terrace railing that would cool under my palms. That's usually how it happens. Cycles aren't broken by accident, they're broken by intent. He looked at me then, his curiosity genuine and sharp. Why didn't you destroy me in there? It was such a blunt, tactical question that I almost smiled. I'm sorry? You could have, he said. The moment General Whitaker saluted you, the power shifted entirely. You could have humiliated me in front of every guest. You could have given a speech, exposed exactly what I'd done, and burned my reputation to the ground. Why didn't you? I think they already saw what they needed to see, I said. He winced, the truth of it stinging. But that's not an answer, he pressed. No, I replied. It isn't. I looked past him through the large glass windows of the ballroom. Inside, I could see Richard speaking quietly with Diane. They looked peaceful. I looked back at Harold. Revenge is a high that lasts about 5 minutes, I said. After that, you still have to live with the person you became to get it. I learned a long time ago that correction and humiliation are not the same thing. One is meant to teach, the other only spreads damage. I had no interest in adding more damage to this family. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of halyards tapping softly against a nearby mast in the harbor. Harold's eyes lowered. I don't know if I've done much teaching in my life. Not today, I said. A corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile appearing despite his melancholy. Fair enough. We stood there in a comfortable silence for a moment, the first one we had ever shared. Then he spoke more quietly, almost to himself. I was wrong about you. But worse than that, I was wrong in front of the people I love most. My wife, my daughter, my son. He swallowed hard. I don't want that to be the last lesson they take from me. That mattered. I understood then what this conversation really was. It wasn't a strategic move to erase his shame, nor was it a desperate plea for forgiveness. It was the first time in perhaps decades that Harold was speaking without performing a role. You can't undo today, I said. But you can decide what kind of man you'll be tomorrow. He nodded once, firmly. Then, after a long pause. I'd like the chance to earn your trust. Not because of your former rank, but because of the character you showed me today. It was the closest thing to true wisdom I had ever heard from him. I considered him carefully. Trust at my age isn't handed out just because someone asks politely, I said. But neither is it withheld forever if the change is real. You can start by speaking to Richard honestly, not as a father giving instructions, but as a man admitting a fault. I can do that. And to Diane, I added. She's been smoothing over your sharp edges for years, Harold. She deserves to stop working so hard. His face shifted, a mixture of shame and recognition. Yes, he whispered. You're right. I usually am. That actually drew a short, genuine laugh out of him. It wasn't much, but it sounded human. He straightened his posture then, not with the stiff arrogance of earlier, but with a sense of quiet intention. For what it's worth, Evelyn, your restraint today said more about your character than any title ever could. I met his eyes. That is the first truly respectful thing you have said to me. He accepted the rebuke without protest. He gave me a small, respectful nod and stepped back toward the doorway. Before disappearing inside, he turned one last time. I am glad my son married you. There was no polish in his voice, no hidden strategy. It was just the truth. And because it was the truth, I believed him. After he left, I remained on the terrace for another minute, listening to the rhythmic lap of the water and the muffled warmth of the reception behind me. I thought about the strange, jagged shape the day had taken, how humiliation had been forged into revelation, and how revelation had turned into something quieter and much harder to earn. It wasn't victory. Not exactly. It was something better. It was perspective. When I finally went back inside, Richard looked up immediately, his eyes searching the room until they found mine. He crossed the floor in an instant. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low with concern. I am now, I said. He glanced toward the hallway where Harold had disappeared a moment earlier. Did he come out here? He did. I slipped my hand into his, feeling the familiar warmth. And I think your father may finally be ready to grow up. Richard stared at me for a heartbeat, stunned, and then he laughed. He really laughed, a deep, relieved sound that felt like the first clear sign that the worst of the day was truly behind us. By the time the evening began to wind down, the atmosphere of the reception had transformed. It was quieter, warmer, and infinitely more honest. It became the kind of gathering where people leaned in closer when they spoke, where laughter came easier, and where whatever had been shaken loose by the afternoon's tension had finally settled into something grounded. The band played softer, slower sets now. Outside, the sky had deepened into a rich navy, the kind of darkness that reflects faintly off the water like a memory rather than a light. Guests began to say their goodbyes, lingering hugs, slow handshakes, and the soft promises to call, to visit, to stay in touch. At our age, you learn that goodbyes are never casual, they carry the weight of time. Richard and I stood near the entrance, thanking the guests as they drifted out. You gave us quite a story to remember, one of the older gentlemen said to me with a conspiratorial smile. I wasn't aiming for a story, I replied. He chuckled. The best stories never are. Another woman squeezed my hand gently as she passed. You handled yourself with such grace, Evelyn. Thank you, I said. But I knew that grace wasn't something I had simply woken up with that morning. It was something built over decades through discipline, restraint, and the hard-won understanding that not every battle deserves to be fought the moment it appears. Sometimes, the most powerful response is simply patience. Diane approached us once the last of the guests had departed. She looked exhausted, but there was a lightness in her step I hadn't seen before. I don't think I've ever experienced a day quite like this, she said, looking between us. I hope that's not a complaint, I replied gently. She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. No, I think it was a lesson. She turned to Richard, touching his arm briefly, then looked back at me with a newfound steadiness. I've spent many years keeping the peace in this family, she said. Sometimes that meant staying quiet when I should have spoken up. That changes today. There was a quiet strength in her voice, a resonance I hadn't heard before. I looked at her and knew she meant it. A few minutes later, Harold joined us. He didn't take his place at the head of the group, and he didn't look for an audience. He simply stood beside us. He cleared his throat lightly. "The staff is beginning the final cleanup," he said. "I've already spoken to the manager about the final arrangements." It was such a mundane, ordinary statement that I almost smiled. It wasn't about control, it was about contribution. It was a small shift, but a real one. Then he turned his attention to his son. "Richard, I owe you something as well." Richard looked at him carefully, his arms crossed, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "You do?" Harold nodded. "I spoke today as if your judgment didn't matter. As if I still had the right to decide what was best for your life." "I know you meant to protect me," Richard said. "Yes," Harold replied. "But protection is not the same as respect. I should have trusted you. And I should have respected the woman you chose without requiring her to prove her worth to me." Richard was quiet for a long moment, letting the words settle. "That would have made today a lot easier, Dad." Harold gave a small, rueful nod. "Yes, it would have." The four of us stood there in a kind of stillness that felt entirely new. It wasn't tense or fragile, it was just unfamiliar, like a room that had been completely rearranged and was still settling into its new shape. Finally, Harold looked at me. "I won't pretend I can undo what I did. But I meant what I said on the terrace. I would like the chance to do better." I held his gaze, measuring the sincerity behind the words. "You'll have that chance, Harold." He nodded, accepting that this was not a full pardon, but it wasn't a rejection either. And sometimes, that middle ground is exactly where real change begins. Later that night, after the venue was dark and the staff had gone home, Richard and I returned to my house by the water. The silence of the coast was back, the kind of profound, peaceful quiet I had always loved. Richard loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table, exhaling a deep, soul-weary breath. "Well," he said, "that wasn't exactly the wedding reception I expected." "No," I agreed, leaning against the counter. "It wasn't." He looked at me, a small, genuine smile forming. "But I think it might have been the one we actually needed." I considered that for a moment. "Yes, I think you're right." He rested his arms on the table. "So, are there any other surprises I should know about? Any other secret lives?" I smiled. "No more ranks." "I promise." "That's a relief," he replied. Then, his voice turning more gentle, "But I'd still like to hear about your life. When you're ready." I walked over and sat across from him, the moonlight spilling across the table. "I am ready," I said. And for the first time since we met, I began to tell him. I didn't tell him everything, and I didn't tell it all at once, but I told him enough. I told him about the years of service, the weight of the decisions I'd made, the people I had led, and the ones I had lost. He listened without interruption, without judgment, and without trying to fit my story into a category he could control. He just listened. And that, more than anything else, told me I had made the right choice. As the night deepened, I stepped out onto my porch one last time. The water was dark and perfectly still. The air carried that familiar, sharp coastal chill. I rested my hands on the railing and let the events of the day wash over me. The insult. The silence. The salute. The apology. The shift. It would be easy to call it justice. It would be easy to frame it as a cinematic moment where truth prevailed and pride was humbled. But life is rarely that clean. What mattered more wasn't that Harold had been proven wrong, it was that he had been given the opportunity to see his error and choose a different path. In the end, titles fade. Positions of power come to an end. Even the most formidable reputations soften with the passage of time. But character is what remains when everything else is stripped away. I turned back toward the warmth of the house where Richard waited. It was a new chapter. Not a perfect one, but a real one. And if there is anything worth carrying forward from a day like that, it is this. Treat people with respect before you know their story, not after. Because by the time you discover who they truly are, it may already be too late to show them who you are.